What you're about to hear isn't just a story. It's an invitation to explore the space between science and spirit, between what we can measure and what we can feel, between the mind we study and the one we live inside every day. You'll be guided through insights from both Western medicine and Eastern wisdom, through personal moments of struggle, silence, and awakening, through questions that don't always have answers, but always lead deeper. This isn't about fixing yourself. It's about remembering who you are beneath the noise. So take a breath, let the world slow down, and listen not just with your ears, but with your attention. Because the frontier we're crossing isn't out there. It's in you. Let's begin. This audiobook inspired by Dr. K, written and published by Audible Aria. Chapter 1, The Inner Frontier. Awakening the mind through science and spirit. When we speak about healing, when we speak about transformation, when we speak about understanding, we must first understand the soil we're growing in. And for many of us, it's soil that's been tilled by two hands, the hand of science and the hand of spirituality. These traditions, these worlds, Eastern contemplative practice and Western medical science, they stand like two great mountains on either side of the human condition. And I've walked between both. So let's set the stage. I've failed. I've struggled with addiction. I've sat in silence. I've studied in ashrams. I've studied in hospitals. I've read textbooks and scriptures. And somewhere along the way, a simple truth emerged. Both of these traditions are broken in different ways. Now, that may sound harsh, but hear me out. Let's start with Western science. Western medicine is powerful. It saves lives. It delivers vaccinations, performs surgeries, stabilizes psychosis, rescues hearts from failure. But here's the truth. It doesn't work for everyone. Not the way we think it does. See, science teaches us about the average human, the average brain, the general pattern. We study populations and probabilities, and we come up with answers that help the middle slice of a very wide spectrum. And those answers, they're useful, but they're also distant. Because when you walk into a doctor's office with your own mind, your own past, your own grief, your own questions, you're not the average, you're you. And that's where clinicians come in. The job of a doctor or a therapist or a psychiatrist isn't to treat the average person. It's to translate the average into the individual. The science doesn't treat you, the clinician does. And that means there's a gap, a translation problem. The science tells us one thing, but it needs to be bent, tailored, and reshaped for you, for your trauma, your biology, your life. And that's not always straightforward. Just because we understand the amygdala or the prefrontal cortex doesn't mean we understand how your thoughts manifest, how your suffering speaks, or how your healing must unfold. Now let's cross the river. Let's walk into the East. In Eastern contemplative traditions, you'll find something radically different. You'll find monks and mystics who don't study the brain from the outside. They study it from within. They don't talk to patients. They sit with themselves. For hours, for days, for years. And from that place of silence, they discover something stunning. The mind can be directly observed. Not through instruments or scans, but by you, from the inside. This is the great strength of the Eastern approach. It trusts the subjective experience. You don't need a doctor to do the work for you. You don't need an expert to interpret your symptoms. You can sit, observe, breathe, and begin to untangle the knots yourself. These are DIY traditions: meditation, breathwork, awareness. No one can do them for you. But here's where that strength becomes a weakness. How do you know if what you're doing is working? How do you know if the practice is right for you? There are no control groups for spiritual growth. There are no referral systems among gurus. In medicine, if I can't help you, I refer you to someone who can. In the world of spiritual teachers, that almost never happens. And that means many people stay in practices that may not be suited for them. They try to meditate, they struggle, and then they conclude, meditation doesn't work for me. But maybe the problem isn't them. Maybe they needed a different path. And here's the kicker: there's no clear way to measure what's working and what's not. We don't have a lab test for enlightenment. We don't have an X-ray for spiritual misalignment. That's the gap in the East. Verification, calibration, differentiation. So on one side, the West gives us structure, data, and verification. But it's impersonal. It doesn't always fit the soul. On the other side, the East gives us tools for internal transformation. But it lacks the systems to validate and personalize that journey. And when we try to live in just one of these worlds, we lose something vital. What's needed, what I've spent my life pursuing, is integration, the science of observation with the wisdom of introspection, the understanding of the average with the insight of the individual. Because your mind is not average. Your suffering is not theoretical. Your healing cannot be mass-produced, and so we arrive at the threshold of this inner frontier, a place where knowledge must meet understanding, where attention becomes the currency of liberation, and where each of us must walk the path ourselves, but not alone. That's where we begin. Chapter 2: The Illusion of Knowledge. We live in a time where knowledge is everywhere. Podcasts, videos, articles, books. An endless stream of content pours into our lives every day. And yet, something strange is happening. Despite the overflow of knowledge, change is rare. Despite the information we consume, we don't seem to transform. And this raises a critical question. What exactly is knowledge? Let's explore that. In many spiritual traditions, especially those rooted in Sanskrit, we find something beautiful and revealing. There's not just one word for knowledge. There are several. And that linguistic difference points to a deeper truth about how humans relate to learning. Two such terms are vidya and jnana. At a glance, both translate to knowledge in English. But the worlds they represent could not be more different. Vidya is objective, it's external, it's transmissible. I can tell you a fact. You can read it in a textbook. You can watch a video that lays it out in clear, digestible points. That's vidya. It's measurable. It can be passed from one person to another. It's what most of us associate with learning, and it's what most of the world rewards. But jnana, that's something else entirely. Jnana is understanding. Not the kind you recite from a flashcard. The kind that lives in your bones. It's internal, it's experiential, it's not transmissible. You can't give it to someone else like a USB stick. You have to arrive at it yourself. And here's the thing. Jnana is what actually changes us. You can tell someone 100 times to stop smoking. You can explain the science of lung damage, addiction pathways, and mortality risk. That's all vidya. It's true, it's rational, and it often has zero impact. But then one day, that person wakes up, walks outside, sees their kid watching them light a cigarette, and something inside them changes. They quit. Not because of information, but because of realization. That's jnana. It's the same with love. You can read about relationships, study attachment theory, listen to advice from friends and therapists. But until you feel it, until you sit across from someone and your walls come down, it's all theory. The moment love is real, you don't need definitions anymore. That's jnana. So now the question becomes, if jnana is what changes us, how do we get it? Can it be cultivated? Yes, but not the way we think. In the West, we often imagine that if we collect enough vidya, it will eventually turn into jnana. That if we read enough books, listen to enough lectures, learn enough facts, something will eventually click. But in truth, it doesn't work that way. The mind doesn't absorb knowledge like water filling a glass. It transforms through friction, through application, through direct experience. There's a story I like to tell. One day I was eating sushi with my kids. They had never encountered wasabi before. To them, it looked like green tea ice cream, sweet, friendly, delicious. I tried to warn them. This isn't what you think it is. But of course curiosity won. One of my daughters took a tiny spoonful, smiling, confident. And then, it hit. Her face twisted. Her eyes watered. The wave of heat crashed in. It was unforgettable. She never confused wasabi for dessert again. In that moment, information became understanding. That's the power of experience. It bypasses theory. It imprints itself. And once jnana arrives, you don't go back. Once you know the stove is hot, you don't need a lecture about fire safety. You just know. That's how real change happens. Not through being told, but through being shown, or more accurately, through discovering for yourself. But that still leaves us with a challenge. How do we go from vidya to jnana without relying on accidents or pain? There are two approaches, one Western, one Eastern. The Western path emphasizes manipulation and engagement. It says, don't just read, play with ideas, challenge them, reflect on them, connect them to your life. When you engage with material, truly wrestle with it. Your brain activates, memory consolidates, insights form. You start to own what you're learning instead of simply borrowing it. That's why summarizing 10 books into a tweet thread might feel productive, but it rarely transforms anyone. Memorization doesn't equal mastery, interaction does. But then there's the Eastern path, the more mysterious one. And this is where things get strange. Because in the Eastern model, understanding doesn't always come from outside. It can arise spontaneously, like a spark from nowhere. You're sitting, you're breathing, you're silent. And then suddenly, you see something clearly that you've never seen before. Not because someone explained it, but because something within you lit up. The Upanishads describe this as self-illumination. The idea that truth lives inside you, not out there. And that all teaching is really about creating the conditions for recognition. Like brushing dust off a mirror. The reflection was always there. You just had to reveal it. This is why practices like meditation, breath control, and focused attention are so central in the Eastern tradition. They don't teach in the conventional sense. They prepare, they cleanse, they open the door. And once it opens, understanding floods in, not from the world, but from within. So we start to see a different model for growth. One that isn't based on downloading more information, but upgrading the internal system that processes it. You don't just read differently. You become different, more receptive, more aware, more tuned in to what was already there, waiting. And when that happens, when jnana arises, you don't need anyone to validate it, because it comes with certainty. Not arrogance, not ego, but a quiet, irreversible knowing, like a seed breaking open after a long winter. It doesn't need to be told to grow. It just does. So yes, knowledge is everywhere. But wisdom is rare. Because wisdom isn't something we consume. It's something we awaken. And the journey from one to the other. That's the true frontier. Chapter 3. The bridge between mind and mechanism. We've talked about knowledge, how information doesn't always become understanding, and how true transformation demands something deeper than facts. But there's a lingering question. If the brain is physical, and the mind is experiential, where exactly do those two things meet? Where does the mechanism end and the mystery begin? Let's explore that bridge. When we study the human mind scientifically, we rely on tools of measurement. Neuroscience, psychology, psychiatry. These fields are built on observation and replication. They ask, what can we measure? Blood chemistry, neural pathways, hormone levels. All incredibly useful. But there's a limit, because no scan has ever shown a thought. No blood test can tell you how much grief is in a heart. No MRI can detect longing or meaning. These are not physical phenomena, yet they shape our lives more powerfully than any molecule. So while we can study the structure of the brain, the content of consciousness, the actual experience of being alive remains outside the reach of our instruments. That's where the Eastern perspective offers something essential. Instead of trying to measure the mind from the outside, it turns inward. The contemplative traditions teach us the only instrument capable of observing the mind is the mind itself. And for thousands of years, yogis, monks, and seekers have trained that instrument with precision, not to control it, but to witness it. In the West, this is some familiar territory. We're trained to trust what we can verify, to rely on data, to treat subjective experience as suspicious. But if we're honest, all science begins with subjectivity. Every hypothesis starts with a human noticing something. Every experiment begins with awareness, so the foundation is already there. The question is whether we're willing to explore it directly. This is where contemplative practice becomes more than a technique. It becomes a method of internal inquiry. When you sit in silence, when you bring awareness to your breath, when you observe your thoughts without clinging to them, something begins to shift. Patterns emerge, reactions soften, clarity arises. And then, unexpectedly, something clicks. You begin to understand not just that you're angry, but how anger arises. Not just that you're anxious, but what anxiety feeds on. You start to feel the mechanics of your own mind. And here's the beauty of it. Those insights don't come from someone telling you what to believe. They come from watching yourself closely enough to see the truth unfold. But this journey isn't easy. In fact, it can be disorienting. Because once you start observing the mind, you realize how chaotic it really is. The thoughts aren't linear. The emotions aren't predictable. And the more you try to control them, the more they slip through your fingers. That's when many people quit. They think meditation isn't working. But in reality, that discomfort is the beginning of awareness. The first step to mastery is noticing the mess. Now let's bring the two worlds together, East and West, science and spirit, structure and silence. In neuroscience, we know that the brain has certain regions responsible for attention, memory, emotion, and self-awareness. But those areas don't operate in isolation. They're part of a larger network, one that adapts responds, and changes based on what we focus on. So when you sit and practice concentration, you are literally reshaping your neural pathways. Focus is not just a spiritual skill. It's a neurological training. There's one system in particular worth understanding: the default mode network. This is the part of the brain responsible for self-referential thinking. The voice in your head that's always commenting, comparing, planning, judging. When this network is hyperactive, we experience anxiety, rumination, and disconnection. But in deep meditation, and also during certain psychedelic states, this network quiets down, the inner chatter softens, and in that silence, something else emerges. Presence, not as a concept, as a state. The interesting thing is that we can now track this scientifically. We can watch the brain deactivate certain regions as someone enters a flow state or deep meditative absorption. We can measure the physiological changes. Lowered cortisol, balanced nervous system activity, increased parasympathetic tone. And these aren't temporary. With consistent practice, the brain changes permanently. But here's what the science can't explain. Why does that silence feel so good? Why does stillness bring peace? Why does presence carry a kind of joy that pleasure never does? This is the mystery. And this is where the Eastern traditions offer a language. Not to define the experience, but to respect it. Words like ananda, meaning bliss, or samadhi, meaning absorption, were not invented to sound poetic. They were crafted to describe real, repeatable, trainable states of consciousness. States that heal not just the mind, but the self beneath it. And so we stand on a bridge, 1 foot in science, grounded in evidence and mechanism. 1 foot in silence, rooted in direct observation and trust. We don't need to choose one over the other. In fact, to truly understand ourselves, we must walk with both. We must be willing to study the brain while also inhabiting the mind. We must understand our chemistry without abandoning our consciousness. And we must allow space for the parts of us that cannot be seen, only felt. Not as a rejection of science, but as its completion. The mechanism matters, but so does the mystery, because what we are, what you are, is not just matter. You are meaning. You are attention. You are that strange, invisible something that notices the thoughts that pass, the breath that rises, the pain that lingers, the love that returns. And the more you watch, the more you realize that something isn't just in you, it is you. Chapter 4. The Power of Experience. What makes experience different from information? Why does a single moment of realization carry more weight than 100 pages of advice? This is where we begin to understand the distinction between outer knowledge and inner truth, and why, for real change to happen, we must move beyond intellect into direct encounter. We've all had moments when something clicked. Maybe you finally understood a lesson you'd heard for years, or you saw yourself clearly for the first time. Not as an idea, but as a living, breathing being with patterns, pain, and potential. That shift, that spark, didn't come from being told. It came from being shown. And often, what shows us is experience. Let's go back to something simple. Learning what's hot. A child touches a stove once, just once, and remembers it forever. You can warn them 1,000 times, but nothing teaches like that single moment of contact. That's because knowledge gained through experience doesn't just sit in the brain. It imprints itself into the body, the nervous system, the reflexes. It becomes part of who you are. This is true of spiritual learning too. You can read about presence, awareness, surrender. You can memorize quotes from saints and sages. But until you actually sit with yourself, in silence, in discomfort, in truth, those teachings remain abstract. They're just words floating in the mind, disconnected from the body. But the moment you experience real stillness, even for 5 seconds, the game changes. You don't just believe it exists, you know it. Now here's the interesting part. That experience doesn't have to come from meditation. It can arise in everyday life. A breakup, a loss, a crisis, a walk in nature, a moment with your child. These are all potential gateways to understanding. Not because they're easy, but because they break the pattern of normalcy. They interrupt the constant stream of thought and demand attention. They show us who we are beneath the roles, the plans, the noise. And once we see that, even briefly, we're never quite the same. This is why experience is the great teacher. Not because it's always pleasant, but because it's undeniable. Once you've experienced love, you can't go back to wondering what it feels like. Once you've faced grief, you can't pretend to fear it the same way again. Experience doesn't just inform you, it transforms you. So how do we create more of these moments? One way is to notice when they already happen. We're often too busy or distracted to realize that transformation is unfolding right in front of us. That sigh at the end of the day, that pause before responding to an argument, that ache in the heart when you realize something's not working. Those are openings, moments when the mind quiets, just enough to hear something deeper. Another way is through practice, and this is where contemplative traditions give us a roadmap. Practices like meditation, breath awareness, and trataka, the candle gazing technique, are not meant to teach in the conventional sense. They are meant to prepare, to create fertile ground for realization to grow. Think of it like this. Understanding is a seed. You can't force it to sprout, but you can water the soil. You can pull the weeds. You can sit with it patiently. And then one day, without effort, without warning, it breaks through. That's what practice does. It doesn't deliver the insight. It readies you to receive it. But here's what's important. The quality of your attention matters more than the quantity of your effort. You can meditate for hours and remain distracted. You can read hundreds of books and stay on the surface. But one moment of true presence, one breath fully felt, one emotion truly met, can reshape your entire inner world. So what blocks us from that? Often, it's our obsession with performance. We turn even our spiritual life into a checklist. How long did I sit today? How many days in a row? Did I do it right? And in doing so, we miss the point. The goal is not to become perfect at practice. The goal is to become present with yourself, honestly, gently, and fully. There's a story in the yogic tradition that speaks to this. A student asks his teacher how long it will take to reach enlightenment. The teacher replies, 10 years. The student says, "What if I work twice as hard?" The teacher pauses, then says, "Then 20 years. It's not about force. It's about sincerity. It's about depth. And it's about patience. Experience will come, not because you demand it, but because you're ready. And when it comes, you'll feel it. It won't be loud. It won't be dramatic. It will be quiet and steady, like a river changing course. You'll suddenly know what you didn't know. You'll feel aligned in a way you can't explain. And most of all, you'll realize that this knowing isn't new. It was always there. You just hadn't met it yet. That's the beauty of the inner path. It doesn't add anything to you. It reveals what's already there. So the next time something shifts, pay attention. That's not just insight, that's the power of experience. Chapter 5. Attention, the currency of consciousness. Let's talk about attention. Not as a productivity hack, not as a mental muscle to optimize, but as the foundation of our inner life. Attention is not just what we focus on, it's what determines the quality of our experience. And today, more than ever, attention is under siege. Think about it. What is a day, really, but a series of moments you paid attention to? What is memory, if not a collection of things you noticed? And what is your identity, if not the sum total of what you consistently give your attention to? Attention, in that sense, is not just a function of the mind. It is the mind. Wherever your attention goes, your life follows. But here's the problem. Our attention is being farmed. Every scroll, every click, every ping is a bid for your awareness. Entire industries are built around hijacking your focus and keeping it there. Not for your growth, but for their profit. We've become commodities in a neuroeconomic war, where the most valuable resource isn't oil or gold. It's your gaze. And the consequences of this theft run deeper than distraction. When we lose control of our attention, we begin to lose control of our minds. The ability to direct thought, to choose focus, to sustain presence. These are not luxuries. They are the foundations of a stable psyche. So what happens when those foundations erode? We become anxious, not just because the world is stressful, but because our minds are splintered. The more scattered our attention, the more fragmented our inner world. And in that fragmentation, anxiety thrives, depression deepens, loneliness expands. It's no accident that mental health issues are rising in tandem with the collapse of focus. When we can't hold attention, we can't hold space. For our emotions, for our relationships, or even for ourselves. Now here's something subtle but important. Distraction feels good in the short term. It numbs discomfort. It offers novelty. But long term, it starves the soul. Because beneath the scrolling and swiping is a quiet truth most of us are trying to avoid. Silence. Silence reveals everything we've been suppressing. The doubts, the grief, the unmet needs. So instead of facing that, we drown it in noise. But the longer we avoid that silence, the more disconnected we become from who we truly are. This is why contemplative traditions begin with attention. Before insight, before bliss, before any grand realization. We must reclaim the ability to be with ourselves. Not run, not numb, just be. And that begins with training attention. In yogic science, this is called dharana, the practice of concentration, choosing an object, a mantra, a flame, and returning to it, over and over, no matter how many times the mind wanders. It's not about achieving stillness. It's about remembering to return. Over time, this shapes the mind, the act of pulling attention back, gently, consistently. It's like a workout for consciousness. The more we practice, the stronger that muscle becomes. And with that strength comes freedom. Not just from distraction, but from unconscious reactivity. Because here's what most people don't realize. When you lose control of your attention, you also lose control of your responses. A single thought can drag you down a spiral. A single comment can hijack your mood. But when attention is trained, you begin to choose where your energy goes. You become less reactive, more centered, less like a leaf blown in the wind, and more like a tree rooted in clarity. And the benefits aren't just internal. When attention is steady, relationships deepen, work becomes meaningful, creativity flows, Even rest becomes restful, because you're present for your life, not merely surviving it. Let's return to something we touched on earlier: flow state. Flow is the natural result of one-pointed attention. When the mind locks onto a task and everything else falls away. Time, ego, doubt. That's flow. And what's remarkable is that it feels good. Not in a fleeting dopamine way, but in a deep, satisfying way. It's a glimpse into what the mind is capable of when it isn't fractured. Now imagine being able to access that, not just occasionally, but regularly. That's what attention training offers. Not just productivity, but presence. Not just focus, but fulfillment. But here's where it gets interesting. Attention doesn't just make you more effective, it makes you more you. The modern world fragments identity. Algorithms shape our preferences. Ads shape our desires. Echo chambers shape our beliefs. But when you reclaim your attention, you begin to rediscover your core. What you actually think, what you actually value, what you actually want. This is why attention isn't just mental, it's spiritual. It's how you come home to yourself. So how do we begin? Start small. 10 breaths. 1 moment of silence. 1 task done with full presence. It doesn't matter what you choose. What matters is that you choose. That you interrupt the cycle of unconscious consumption and reclaim 1 moment at a time. And when distraction comes, and it will, don't judge it. Don't fight it. Just return. That return is the practice. That return is the path. Because attention is not a switch you flip. It's a relationship you build. With your mind, with your moment, and ultimately, with your life. So protect it. Cultivate it. Honor it. Because attention isn't just a tool. It's the currency of consciousness. And when you learn to spend it wisely, your whole world changes. Chapter 6. The shadow we carry. There's a part of ourselves we rarely want to see. It lurks beneath the surface, hidden behind masks of competence, positivity, and control. It shows up in our defensiveness, our overreactions, our compulsions. It lives in the unexplored places of the psyche, the places we're afraid to look. This is the shadow, not evil, not broken, just unseen. The shadow forms when we begin to divide ourselves into what is acceptable and what is not. As children, we receive messages. Don't be angry. Don't cry. Don't be lazy. And over time, we internalize those rules. We start hiding parts of ourselves. Not because they're wrong, but because they weren't welcomed. Anger gets buried. Grief gets masked. Vulnerability gets armored. But these parts don't disappear. They go underground. And from that place, they begin to influence us in ways we can't see. We sabotage relationships. We chase validation. We numb ourselves with achievement. And all the while, we tell ourselves we're fine. But something feels off. Something always feels just slightly out of alignment. That's the shadow speaking. The irony is that most of our suffering doesn't come from our flaws. It comes from our refusal to face them. When you suppress emotion, it doesn't vanish. It stagnates. It grows heavy. And eventually, it demands release. Not in gentle ways, but in outbursts, addictions, and self-doubt. So the work is not to be perfect. It's to become whole. Wholeness means reclaiming every part of yourself, even the messy, painful, inconvenient ones. It means turning toward the anger instead of pretending it's not there. It means sitting with your sadness instead of distracting yourself from it. It means understanding that what you suppress becomes what controls you. Now let's talk about how this shows up in the modern world. We live in a culture that prizes positivity. Good vibes only. Be grateful. Manifest your best life. And while these messages are well-intentioned, they often lead us to bypass real emotion. They tell us subtly that discomfort is a problem, that pain is a failure, that if you feel something dark, something must be wrong with you. But nothing is wrong with feeling. Emotion is not pathology, it's information. If you feel anger, it may be pointing to a boundary crossed. If you feel sadness, it may be revealing a loss ungrieved. If you feel fear, it may be signaling a risk worth understanding. Emotions are not enemies. They're messengers. But when we silence them, they start to scream in other ways. Through the body, through behavior, through burnout. This is where shadow work begins. With the courage to feel. To sit with what's real, even if it's ugly. Even if it contradicts the image you've built. Even if it breaks your heart. Because only through feeling can you begin to understand. And only through understanding can you begin to heal. There's a practice I recommend. Sit in silence, close your eyes, and ask yourself, what am I not allowing myself to feel right now? Don't answer with your mind. Let the answer rise. Maybe it's guilt. Maybe it's envy. Maybe it's exhaustion. Whatever comes, welcome it. Not to indulge it, but to witness it. Because the moment something is seen, it begins to lose its grip. This isn't about wallowing, it's about integrating. When you face your shadow, you reclaim your power. You stop projecting. You stop blaming. You stop needing the world to be a certain way in order for you to feel okay. You become responsible, not in a burdensome way, but in a liberating one. Responsibility means the ability to respond, not react. And that's what healing the shadow gives you. Space. Between feeling and action. Between pain and reaction. Between the past and the present. Now here's something important. The shadow's not just personal. It's also collective. Families have shadows. Cultures have shadows. Generations pass down unspoken pain. Trauma that was never named. Wounds that were never healed. And if we don't bring those shadows into the light, we repeat them. Not because we want to, but because they live in us. Healing isn't just for you. It's for those who came before you, and those who will come after. So when you do this work, when you sit with your fear, when you honor your anger, when you grieve what you never let yourself grieve, you're breaking a cycle. You're becoming the one who says, "This ends with me." And that is sacred work. But you don't have to do it alone. Find spaces that honor the whole human. Not just the parts that smile. Find teachers who don't promise perfection, but invite presence. Find practices that help you hold yourself, not fix yourself. Because you are not a problem to solve. You are a mystery to witness. And the more you witness, the more you realize. The shadow isn't trying to hurt you. It's trying to find you. It's knocking on the door, asking to be let in. Not as an intruder, but as a long-lost part of you that wants to come home. So open the door, let it in, because the light you seek isn't on the other side of the shadow. It shines through it. Chapter 7. The Weight of Suppression. Every day, we carry more than we realize. Not just responsibilities, not just tasks, but emotions, suppressed, unspoken, unacknowledged. And over time, this emotional weight begins to shape how we think, how we act, and how we experience the world. We don't just suppress feelings. We suppress entire parts of ourselves. Suppression isn't always conscious. In fact, most of the time, it's not. It happens quietly, automatically. We tell ourselves we're fine when we're not. We swallow frustration to keep the peace. We numb disappointment because we don't want to seem ungrateful. And we do it so often, we forget we're doing it at all. But the body remembers. It remembers every fight you avoided, every tear you didn't let fall, every truth you didn't speak. And that remembrance doesn't stay buried. It expresses itself in tension, fatigue, irritation, anxiety. These aren't random symptoms. They're signals. The body is trying to tell you something the mind refused to feel. This is the cost of suppression. Not just emotional numbness, but disconnection. From your body, from your needs, from your intuition. And the more you disconnect, the harder it becomes to know what you want, or how you feel, or why you're struggling. You lose touch with your inner compass. Let's make this real. Imagine someone who was taught never to show anger. Good kids don't get mad. Anger is dangerous. Control yourself. So they grow up suppressing that energy. They become agreeable, compliant, easy to get along with. But inside, resentment builds, boundaries get crossed, needs go unmet. And eventually, it erupts. Not as calm communication, but as rage or shutdown. The anger didn't disappear. It waited, or take someone who was told not to cry. Be strong. Don't be weak. So they suppress grief. They don't allow themselves to mourn. They become emotionally distant. Not because they lack feeling, but because they're drowning in unprocessed sorrow. And in trying to seem strong, they become fragile. This is what suppression does. It doesn't make pain go away. It just drives it deeper, where it becomes more destructive. And here's the irony. We suppress because we're trying to protect ourselves from judgment, from rejection, from pain. But what we end up doing is trapping ourselves inside a cage of our own making. A cage built from all the emotions we refuse to feel. So how do we release this weight? It begins with permission, the simple, radical act of saying to yourself, it's okay to feel this. Whatever this is, rage, grief, shame, loneliness, even joy. So many of us are afraid to feel joy because we're waiting for the other shoe to drop. We preemptively suppress pleasure to avoid disappointment. But emotion is meant to move. That's why it's called emotion. Energy in motion. When you let it move, it passes. It completes its arc. But when you trap it, it festers. There's a practice I often recommend. Emotional labeling. Not intellectually, but somatically. Sit for a few minutes. Bring awareness to the body. Where do you feel tightness? Where is there pressure? Then ask, what emotion is this? You don't need to name it perfectly. Just get close. Sadness? Anger? Fear? Let the body speak. Then breathe into that space. Not to make the emotion go away, but to give it room. And if tears come, let them. If trembling comes, let it. That's not weakness. That's release. Now here's what's important. This isn't about indulging every feeling. It's about integrating them. Suppression is denial. Indulgence is entrapment. Integration is balance. You allow the emotion to be seen, to be felt, and then to be released. Sometimes we need help with this. A therapist, a support group, a friend who can hold space without fixing. Because for many of us, the reason we learn to suppress is because we never had anyone safe enough to feel with. So part of healing is creating that safety, internally and externally. And when we begin to release suppression, something amazing happens. We feel lighter, clearer, more grounded. We start responding instead of reacting. We stop overcompensating. We begin to live in alignment with what's true, not what's expected, not what's polished, what's real. That's freedom. But it's not a one-time event. It's a practice, a commitment to stay present with yourself, a willingness to feel, even when it's inconvenient, a decision to carry truth instead of tension. And truth is lighter. You don't have to hold it in anymore. You don't have to pretend anymore. You don't have to suppress. You can feel, you can release. You can return to yourself. Because beneath all that weight, you're still there, waiting to be felt, waiting to be free. Chapter 8. Healing is not linear. We often think of healing as a destination, a place we'll arrive at once. We've read the right books, practiced the right techniques, or had enough time pass. We imagine a straight road from pain to peace, where each step forward brings us closer to completion. But healing doesn't move in straight lines. It moves in spirals. You'll revisit the same wounds again and again. The grief that felt resolved resurfaces in a new season. The anger you thought was gone reappears in a different relationship. And it's tempting, in those moments, to think you've failed. To believe all the progress you made has vanished. But it hasn't. What's happening isn't regression. It's deepening. You're not in the same place. You're meeting the same pain from a new level of awareness. This is the nature of inner work. It unfolds in layers. Each time you peel one back, you find another. Not because the previous work was ineffective, but because the psyche protects itself. It only reveals what you're ready to feel. And as your capacity expands, so does your access to the parts of you that need healing. Think of it like a muscle that's been injured. The first stage is rest. Then comes rehabilitation. Small movements, slow stretches, then strength building. But even years later, that muscle may ache when the weather changes. It doesn't mean it's broken again. It means it's remembering. And that memory is part of the body's wisdom. The same is true for the heart. When you feel old pain rising, it's not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of readiness. You're strong enough now to feel more fully, to hold what you couldn't hold before. That's progress. Even when it hurts. But we live in a culture obsessed with outcomes. We want to measure growth, track results, declare success. And while that can be useful, it's also misleading because healing isn't always visible. Sometimes progress looks like crying for the first time in years. Sometimes it looks like saying no. Sometimes it looks like collapsing into grief. Not because you're broken, but because you've finally stopped resisting. Real healing doesn't always feel good. Sometimes it feels like falling apart. Like everything you've built to protect yourself is crumbling. But what's actually happening is dismantling of the masks, the stories, the illusions. And beneath all that, something truer begins to emerge. Stillness, clarity, wholeness. But let's be honest. It's terrifying to let go of who you've been. Even when it hurts. The familiar pain becomes a kind of identity. We tell ourselves, this is just how I am, or this is how life works. And we cling to those beliefs, not because they're true, but because they're safe. But healing asks us to question that safety, to step into the unknown, to risk becoming someone we've never been, someone unburdened. And yes, there will be setbacks. There will be days when you numb out, shut down, or fall into old patterns. That's not failure. That's human. The key is not to avoid falling. The key is to remember how to return. Return to breath. Return to presence. Return to compassion. Because healing isn't about never getting lost. It's about shortening the time it takes to find your way back. This is why self-compassion matters. Not as a feel-good slogan, but as a survival skill. When you treat yourself with harshness, you reinforce shame. You delay growth. But when you meet yourself with gentleness, even in your messiest moments, you create space for real transformation. There's a phrase from Buddhist teaching: no mud, no lotus. The idea that beauty doesn't bloom in spite of the darkness, but because of it. The mud nourishes the flower. The pain becomes the teacher. So instead of judging the spiral, honor it. Instead of fearing the return of old emotions, welcome them as old friends. Not because you enjoy suffering, but because you recognize that every visit is an opportunity to heal at a deeper level. And know this: you are not behind. You are not broken. You are becoming. Every tear, every stumble, every moment of doubt is part of the path. Not a detour, not a mistake. The path itself. And if you ever wonder whether you're making progress, don't look at how often you fall. Look at how you rise. Look at how you speak to yourself in pain. Look at how willing you are to try again. That's the measure. Not perfection. Presence, not speed. Sincerity, not control. Courage. So let the spiral turn. Let it carry you deeper. Because healing is not a straight road. It's a sacred dance. And every step, every sway, every return to center is enough. You are enough. Right here, right now, just as you are. Chapter 9. The Crisis of Disconnection. There's a strange paradox in the modern world. We are more connected than ever before. To data, to content, to each other. And yet, we feel more alone, more fragmented, more unseen. The crisis we face today isn't one of information or access. It's a crisis of disconnection from self, from others, and from meaning. This disconnection is subtle. It doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just whispers. A quiet sense that something's missing. A numbness in moments that should feel full. A constant search for stimulation that never quite satisfies. And when we try to trace it, we often look outward. Blame the job, the relationship, the news, the phone. But the real distance is inward. We've lost touch with the core of who we are. Not our roles, not our achievements, but our being. The truth is, most people don't know how to be with themselves. Silence feels awkward. Stillness feels empty. And when we slow down, we're quickly met with discomfort. Boredom, anxiety, restlessness. So we keep moving, keep scrolling, keep consuming. But the more we run from ourselves, the further we get from peace. Disconnection starts as avoidance, but it ends in suffering. When we disconnect from the body, we miss its signals. Of hunger, of exhaustion, of desire. We push through fatigue, override intuition, lay from the neck up. We become floating minds, cut off from the wisdom beneath. When we disconnect from our emotions, we flatten. Joy feels muted. Grief lingers unexpressed. Anger leaks sideways. And over time, we start to feel numb. Not because we're broken, but because we're guarded. And when we disconnect from others, intimacy becomes difficult. We stop sharing vulnerably. We fear being seen too deeply. Our relationships become performative, a dance of masks rather than a meeting of hearts. But at the root of all this disconnection is one central wound. The belief that we are not enough as we are. That if we slow down, we'll fall behind. That if we show our pain, we'll be rejected. That if we stop achieving, we'll lose our worth. So we keep proving, pleasing, performing. All in the hope that someone, somewhere, will finally tell us we're okay. But what if the voice we're waiting for isn't out there? What if it's within us? Reconnection begins with that question. The willingness to turn inward. Not to fix, but to feel. not to analyze, but to listen. Because deep down, there is a part of you that's always been connected. To truth, to beauty, to love. You've just been taught to tune it out. So how do we remember? We begin by creating space. Not just in the schedule, but in the soul. Space to breathe, to feel, to wonder, to do nothing. Not as laziness, but as presence. We begin by returning to the body. Through breath, through movement, through sensation. Letting awareness drop from the head into the heart. From the heart into the belly. From the belly into the ground. Rooting ourselves in the now. We begin by embracing discomfort. Letting silence reveal what noise has hidden. Letting stillness teach what motion has ignored. Knowing that what we find inside, no matter how messy, is worthy of compassion, not correction. And we begin by reaching out, not from performance, but from presence, speaking honestly, asking vulnerably, listening fully, letting others see us not as polished personas, but as whole human beings. This is what it means to reconnect, not to become someone new, but to remember who you've always been, a being of awareness, a presence behind the thoughts, a witness to the waves of experience, not separate from life, but inseparable from it. And when we live from that place, everything shifts. Work becomes meaningful, not because it brings status, but because it expresses soul. Relationships become sacred, not because they fulfill us, but because they mirror us. Pain becomes bearable, not because it disappears, but because it's held in compassion. Even solitude becomes sweet, not as isolation, but as intimacy with self. This is not a quick fix. It's a return to the body, a return to truth, a return to presence. And in that return, the disconnection dissolves. Not because the world changed, but because you did. You remembered. You came home, and home was never out there. It was always within. Chapter 10. The Return to Wholeness. If this journey has taught us anything, it's that the answers we seek are not hidden in distant places. They're not locked in ancient texts or exclusive practices. They are within us, waiting for attention, waiting for stillness, waiting for the courage to return. Wholeness isn't something we achieve. It's something we remember. Beneath the layers of conditioning, beneath the trauma and expectation, beneath the polished masks we wear, there is a self that has never been broken. A self that doesn't need to be fixed, only revealed. But to return to that self, we must walk through the wilderness of our own mind. We must face the discomfort we've avoided, the pain we've suppressed, the parts of us we've abandoned to survive. And we must do so not with violence, but with presence, not with judgment, but with compassion. This is the great paradox. Healing does not come from force. It comes from allowing yourself to feel what you feel, to want what you want, to rest when you're tired, to grieve when you're hurting, to celebrate when you're joyful, without apology, without justification. We often search for practices, tools, techniques, and those are helpful. But their purpose is not to create transformation. Their purpose is to create space for it. You don't grow a tree by pulling on its leaves. You grow it by tending the soil, by giving it light, water, and patience. And in the same way, your job is not to force your healing. Your job is to create the conditions in which healing becomes possible. To listen, to pause, to slow down long enough to hear the wisdom that's already there. Because it's there. In every breath, in every ache, in every moment of awareness. When we stop running from ourselves, something beautiful happens. We begin to trust ourselves, not because we have all the answers, but because we're no longer afraid of the questions. We begin to soften, not into weakness, but into strength. The kind of strength that bends without breaking, that loves without losing itself, that speaks truth even when the voice shakes. We begin to feel, not just the highs, but the lows. And in doing so, we discover that joy and sorrow are not opposites. They are companions. Two notes in the same song. One gives depth to the other, and we begin to connect. To life, to others, to the world around us, not as something to conquer or escape, but as something to participate in, fully and freely. This is wholeness, not perfection, not performance, presence. It's waking up to the fullness of your own humanity, to the mess and the magic, the wounds and the wisdom, the shadow and the light, and saying, yes, this is me, all of it. There is no final state of enlightenment, no permanent arrival, just this. Moment by moment, the practice of returning to breath, returning to truth, returning to yourself. Because when you return, you remember. And when you remember, you reconnect. And when you reconnect, you heal. Not by becoming someone new, but by becoming fully who you are. Whole, here, now. Thank you for listening.